September 1885 in Pinnacle Ridge was unforgiving. The golden dust, kicked up by gusts of wind, settled into every crack, coated the rough walls of the saloon, and covered the sign of Caldwell and Sons Law Office with a thin layer. It was on this scorching, humid afternoon that Eleanor Vance, a widow, arrived in town to settle the affairs of her late husband. Her carriage, upholstered in expensive but faded fabric, contrasted with the harsh landscape of the Wild West, as did Eleanor herself. She was 38, but the year spent in a marriage with a man who knew neither how to live nor how to die had left deep shadows of weariness on her face. Her grey eyes, usually calm and thoughtful, were now like two extinguished embers, waiting for a spark. She wore a simple travel dress that, despite its modesty, revealed a woman from another world, a world where the law was more than just a word. In the office, Arthur Caldwell, an elderly lawyer with a face like moth-eaten parchment, sighed heavily, wiping sweat from his brow. "Madam Vance," he said, tapping a paper, "your inheritance is not just money and bonds. It's also the Silver Creek Ranch. Excellent land, excellent cattle. But to manage it, you understand, you need a rancher, a reliable man." He fell silent, his gaze shifting to the door, which opened without a knock, letting in a breath of hot air. John Blackwood entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with a tanned face and honest, direct eyes the color of autumn leaves. He was the embodiment of everything Caldwell meant. His leather vest, faded shirt, and sturdy boots spoke of hard work and reliability. His smile was wide and sincere, like the endless expanse of the prairies. "John Blackwood is the most respected man in the county," Caldwell continued. "Everyone knows him. He built his own ranch from the ground up. And he has what you need, mum, experience. He can manage yours until you decide what to do next." John nodded in greeting, his gaze direct and open. His reputation preceded him, and everyone in town knew that this man was not one to hide. He didn't speak much, but every word he said carried weight. He was what a true rancher should be. Eleanor, in turn, saw in him not just a business partner, but a symbol of stability, a man who could take her shattered life and give it shape again. She was already about to extend her hand in agreement, but at that very moment, as she was about to do so, her gaze fell upon something behind John. There, in the shadow of the doorway, stood a girl. She was as motionless as a shadow, and seemed to be barely breathing. Her dress, made of coarse grey fabric, was neat but clearly too large for her. She was as thin as a stem, and her pale skin contrasted sharply with her jet black hair, pulled back in a tight braid. The most striking thing about her were her eyes. They did not express fear or shyness, as one might expect. They were deep and incredibly mature, filled with the kind of understanding that comes to people who have seen too much pain in their lives. There was no hope in them, only a quiet, almost petrified, resolve. She was staring intently at John, but not at his face. She was looking at his hands. Her fingers nervously picked at the hem of her dress. "You need a rancher," Caldwell repeated. But Eleanor's gaze did not return to John. It was fixated on this girl, whose eyes seemed to see something more than her current pose. Her hands, so small and fragile, could not find peace. They fluttered, as if there was something in them that needed to be hidden. Eleanor saw a tiny, almost imperceptible movement in her hands, as if she was trying to conceal something. Instead of answering Caldwell, Eleanor turned to John, her voice quiet, but with a hint of steel she hadn't known she possessed. "Who is that girl, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked. Her question sounded like a gunshot in the silence. For a moment, everything froze. John's smile vanished, his shoulders tensed, and the girl in the doorway froze, as if sensing danger. Eleanor's question hung in the air. John Blackwood froze for a moment, and an emotion that Eleanor couldn't decipher flashed across his face, a mix of embarrassment and an almost painful caution. He slowly turned to the girl, and his gaze was as gentle and protective as a shepherd's looking at his lamb. The girl, feeling his attention, lowered her head, her fingers, like frightened moths, stilled on her dress. "This is Irene," John said quietly. He didn't call her his daughter, niece, or a distant relative. Just Irene. She helps me with the chores. We came to town for supplies." His voice was steady, but Eleanor, with her sharp hearing, caught a slight, barely perceptible tremor in it, like a torch string. "As far as I know, Mr. Blackwood, you are a solitary man," Eleanor said, not taking her eyes off the girl. "You live alone on your ranch. Why didn't you say you had an assistant?" Her tone was not accusatory, but rather questioning, almost demanding. She wasn't looking for a scandal. She was looking for the truth. The girl in the doorway flinched at her words, and John, in response to her question, merely shrugged, his face turning to stone. "I don't think that's relevant, Mrs. Vance. We are here to discuss the ranch." Caldwell, who had been silent until then, intervened with a sigh of relief. Yes, ma'am, let's get back to business. We don't have much time. If you agree, we can draw up the contract right now." But Eleanor ignored him. She took a few steps toward Irene, and the girl, like a frightened fawn, retreated into the shadows. When Eleanor got closer, she saw the reason why the girl's fingers were so nervously fiddling with the hem of her dress. One of her sleeves was torn at the wrist, and a thin, barely noticeable scratch peeked out from underneath, which Irene was trying to hide. But it wasn't just a scratch. It looked like a thin mark from something sharp, applied with force. Eleanor had seen hundreds of such scratches on her late husband's hands when he returned home, her failed deals, and rowdy evenings at the saloon. "Show me your hand, Irene," Eleanor said softly, but firmly, extending her hand. The girl looked up at her, her eyes full of fear and a strange plea. In them, Eleanor read not just despair, but something more. They were the eyes of a person who had seen too much pain to believe in kindness, but was still waiting for it. It was like a silent cry for help, wrapped in a mask of humility. John Blackwood stepped forward sharply and stood between them. "Mrs. Vance, I beg you, leave this." His voice became harsher. "It's none of your business." For the first time, Eleanor felt her fragile but strict composure waver. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "I can see that you are a kind man, but I can also see that you are hiding something. I can't just entrust my property to you without knowing who this girl is and why she's so afraid of you." Her words were less an accusation than a challenge. "I am a widow. I have no one, and I'm not going to entrust my life to the first person I meet who has hidden secrets." At that moment, a tall, unkempt man in dirty clothes burst into the office, reeking of whiskey and sweat. He was covered in dust, and his eyes were red and bloodshot. "Ah, there you are, Blackwood," he growled. "Did you think I wouldn't find you? You'll pay for what you—" He stopped, his gaze falling on Irene, and then on Eleanor. He smirked, his face contorted. "Oh, look at that. I didn't know you brought your to a date with a widow." Without waiting for him to finish the sentence, John Blackwood spun around and punched him in the face. The blow was strong, and the man fell to the floor, breaking his nose. "One more word, and I'll put a bullet through your filthy mouth, Bobby," he said, his voice cold as the winter wind. Then, without looking at Caldwell or Eleanor, he grabbed Irene's hand and quickly led her out of the office, leaving behind dust hanging in the air, things unsaid, and Eleanor's shocked gaze. It occurred to her that she had just been on the verge of entrusting her fate to a man who was hiding so many secrets. Eleanor Vance remained in Caldwell's office as if in a daze. The air still vibrated with the echo of the blow, and on the floor lay a motionless, groaning Bobby. The lawyer, embarrassed and flustered, hastily helped him to his feet and tried to seat him on a chair. "Ma'am, he began, but Eleanor didn't listen to him. Her gaze was fixed on the same spot where John and Irene had just been, their silhouettes disappearing in the light of the midday sun. All her feelings, her calculations, and her carefully constructed plan crumbled to dust. She could not trust a man who so quickly shifted from a calm rancher to a fierce protector. What was that?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to Caldwell. The lawyer wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Bobby Grover," he stuttered in response. "A known troublemaker in town. A drunkard and, in short, an unpleasant man. He and Blackwood have a long-standing feud. He often visits his ranch, tries to, well, in short, causes problems. What kind of problems? Eleanor looked at the lawyer, her gaze cold and penetrating as a blade. Petty theft, threats, nothing serious, ma'am. The police know about him. He never attacked Blackwood openly. Until today. Caldwell nervously adjusted his glasses. Now that this is settled, let's get back to the deal. Mr. Blackwood just didn't have the time to. Forget about the deal. Mr. Caldwell. Eleanor interrupted him, her voice firm and uncompromising. I cannot entrust my life and my property to a man who hides such a secret. I must know who this girl is and why she's so terrified. Whatever is happening, it is much more important than any deal. Caldwell opened his mouth to say something, but Eleanor was already heading for the door. Please, do me a favor, she said without turning around. When he returns, and he will return, I am sure of it. Tell him I am waiting for him, but not here. She turned and looked at him. Tell him I will be waiting for him at the local hotel, at the Old Cowboy. I will not leave town until I get answers. With these words, Eleanor left the office. The dust raised by John had already settled, but it continued to swirl in her soul. She had no plan, but her instincts, which had never failed her, screamed that this story was not over. Widows who have suffered loss often develop a special sharpness of perception. Eleanor knew this about herself. She saw what others tried not to notice and heard what others kept silent about. The scratch on the girl's hand was one of those silent testimonies. She walked down the main street, heading toward the hotel. The town was going about its usual life. Men in hats stood outside the saloon, discussing the latest news. Women in long dresses came out of stores with purchases. Children played on the dusty road. But Eleanor saw all this as if through a fog. Her thoughts were entirely consumed by John and Irene. Entering the hotel, she rented a room and settled at a table in the main hall, ordering a cup of tea. She couldn't sit still. Her eyes constantly darted to the window, looking for them. The tension was building, but it was not the tension she felt during business negotiations. It was the tension a person feels on the verge of a revelation of truth. About an hour later, as the sun began to set, she saw them. John and Irene were walking down the street toward her hotel. Irene walked ahead, her head down, John following her, his hands clenched into fists. Their walk was resolute, and Eleanor knew they were coming for her. John entered first, his gaze immediately finding her. He was grim, and his eyes were full of weariness and pain. Behind him, like a shadow, slid Irene, her hands hidden in the folds of her dress. John approached her table and, without a word, sat down opposite her. Irene remained standing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Caldwell told me you wanted to talk, John said, his voice husky. Yes, Eleanor replied, placing her hands on the table. I want you to tell me everything. John was silent. His gaze went sideways, and he seemed to turn back into the solitary, reserved man she knew him to be by reputation. Finally, he exhaled and turned to Irene. Irene, he said, show her. The girl raised her head, her eyes full of tears. She slowly took her hand out from under her dress. Eleanor's gaze slid to her wrist and froze. The scratch she had noticed earlier was only part of the horrible picture. The girl's arm was covered with dozens of old, chalk-white scars, crisscrossing each other like a network. These were not just scratches, but traces of something far more terrible. A year ago, John began, his voice trembling. I found her in the woods, almost unconscious. She was running from Bobby, John finished, his voice barely audible. He looked at Irene, and then back at Eleanor, as if to make sure she understood the full gravity of the situation. He was her father. She tried to escape him over a year ago. I found her in the woods, almost unconscious. She was covered in bruises, wounds, and scars, and this, he pointed to her arm, was from him. John looked away, his face contorted in pain. I couldn't just leave her there. I took her to the ranch, cared for her, nursed her back to health. She was like a cornered animal. She didn't say a word. She was afraid of every sound, every rustle. I tried to find her relatives, but there were none. Her mother had died, and no one was looking for her. Eleanor listened to him, her heart aching with pity and compassion. She no longer saw a mysterious rancher and a frightened girl. She saw two lonely people who had found refuge in each other. Bobby Grover, she said quietly. Did he come to the ranch? Constantly, John replied. He wants her back. He doesn't care what she thinks. He just wants her back to work for him, to bring him money, to serve as his entertainment. I can't let that happen. That's why I'm looking for someone to be with her when I'm not around. At that moment, Eleanor remembered her own words. She was looking for a rancher to take care of her ranch. But John was looking for someone to take care of Irene. She realized that all this time he hadn't been thinking about money or a deal. He had been thinking about her safety. And why didn't you go to the police? Eleanor asked. John gave a bitter chuckle. The police. Bobby Grover and Sheriff Clayton are old drinking buddies. I tried, but nothing came of it. He always gets away with it. And now that I'm not making a deal, I know he'll be back. And he won't be alone. He sighed heavily and looked at Irene. I have to protect her. At that moment, Eleanor realized she hadn't just found a rancher. She had found a man who was willing to sacrifice everything for another. She looked at Irene, who had been standing silently all this time, her head bowed, her shoulders trembling with hunched hairs. Eleanor slowly stood up, walked over to her, and gently took her hand. Irene did not pull back. Her hand was cold and lifeless, but in her eyes, when she raised them, there was hope. Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor said, her voice soft but firm. I know you didn't think I'd say this, but I agree. I will accept your deal. I'll buy your ranch, and you and Irene, you'll move in with me. We'll be a family. And as for Bobby, I have some ideas on how we can get rid of him. John and Irene exchanged glances. In their eyes was a mix of surprise, joy, and disbelief. Eleanor knew that she had just changed not only her own life, but theirs as well. They were on the brink of despair, and she had offered them a helping hand. She was no longer a widow looking for a rancher. She was a woman who had found a purpose in life, to protect those who needed it. We won't just be living together, Mr. Blackwood, she said, smiling. We'll be a family, and no one will be able to tear us apart. And now, if you don't mind, I want you to tell me everything about your ranch. It seems we have a lot to do. She took Irene's other hand, and the three of them, like three lost souls, finally found each other. The hotel doors swung open, and they walked out into the street, walking toward their new life, their new beginning.